1914 Galicia, The World Undone. As I said at the intro stage, this is a review copy. I don't think that's going to be too much of a factor here, the fact that I got a free Gamer 4 out of it. Its compatriot is the East Prussia module of it. I don't have the map for that yet. And it will also include a Serbia module, and all three can be played together. The first thing that I kind of thought about when I was looking at this was, oh look, an operational, kind of classic looking game on, subject that's maybe not all that common, but it's been covered, and covered at about this level. Maybe this is the lightest treatment that I've seen overall of it, because the SPI Great War in the East is, I think, a little bit more complicated, or at least, what it's attempting is a little more complicated than what this is attempting. But I don't have one on Galicia. The Quadra game for Great War in the East is not cheap, and like, hey, man, let's see what it does. Does this replace any need for that? And also, as because it's not cheap and maybe a little heavier for the SPI game, this might be a little bit more appealing to introductory gamers. So that was some of my thought there. I see an audience for this of two types of gamers: the introductory gamer and the old school gamer who's got a nostalgia about this type of game and wants to keep playing things of this nature and isn't really, all that intrigued by all the newer stuff that's come out since, like, say, 77 or so. I don't know, 75. For me, I was kind of a child of that 78, 77 era. That's when I first started picking up games, I guess, and some of the little bit more exploration of detail, etc., that they were taking into account is what I was used to, although it was a hurdle to first deal with. And then since then, I've always been into newer stuff, more innovation. Let's get something interesting. Now, that has its problems, because the learning curve on each new thing is harder, and the more and more new things I have in my head, not new anymore, but the more and more different things I have in my head, the harder it is to kind of cram more in there, I guess, and certainly to remember them and to differentiate from one another. So, I understand the desire to go back to that simpler era. Let's talk a little about components for this. First of all, the map appears... So, components has an issue here, which is that the... don't know what to call them. The company that produces these, I guess the producer of the games, including, this one is designed by the owner of the company, is finding a new printer, which means you may not be getting the same components if in some short period after he's gotten one, or if he sells the games to another company, you end up you might end up getting different quality components. But the map is perfectly fine in and of itself. I like the color scheme on it. It evokes that later part of the Classics era, sort of. The clean SPI look. No problem with it at all. One thing that I did have a bit of difficulty with, first of all, there's some information, there's no map key, stuff like that, that's just kind of missing, that doesn't cause a real problem, but it's just kind of expected. And there's large areas of the map that probably aren't going to be used in any game that's not a complete blowout, like mine was. One of the more clever things is there's two different CRTs, one for each player, and they are a little different. Not terribly different. The armies, especially here with Russia and Austria, were constituted in not that different a fashion, and the type of CRT that it is, it basically gives results as eliminations, exchanges, and retreats of various length, is not gonna really tweak things too much. It's similar to a number of other games that came from that era that I kind of like, that use the same CRT for both sides, but maybe with like something that shifts it. So I'm thinking here a game like Desert Fox, where the morale quality of the unit of the individual units ends up meaning that you fight on a slightly different table, but it's all presented on the same table. Here, the counters have very little information on them, so there's not room for that extra, and some of that may have to do with the printing quality. There's not much room for an extra number or something. And that also creates a busyness factor. Unfortunately for me, I'm more used to that busyness on a counter, even though my eyes are going, than keeping track that there are two CRTs. So I was regularly forgetting about the one that the rules were sitting on top of. How big a difference did that make? I don't think much. I think early in the game I was rolling on the correct one, and I only caught myself later on rolling incorrectly once, but that's because I flubbed up my Austrian attack initially terribly, and that kind of laid the groundwork for the entire game to go south. In terms of the story it's telling, it was not showing the Galician campaign from 1914 at all. It was showing something where the Austrians got butchered early on and the Russians slowly were pushing them back continuously, as opposed to the Austrians pushing forward, gaining some ground initially, and then getting beaten and pushed back, not nearly as far. The rule book, well, there's a little bit of slickness to it, and again, this is going to be the printer's doing, so it may change. But I suspect it would take pencil. I didn't have to put anything in, I don't think, even though there were a lot of little issues that are things that just, weren't explicitly stated, some of which would be very, very difficult for the new gamer to deal with, and might make older gamers really, really grumpy in terms of, well, why couldn't they have said this? Why wouldn't they explicitly say this? Because a rules lawyer is going to perhaps come in and argue the other side, but even with my experience, I had difficulty knowing, which way to do something. So, for example, reinforcements, except for the reinforcements that come on turn 2 and 3, and there are a couple of misprints too, but and no errata. There's some typos, misprints, and stuff like that, and there's no errata, no clarifications online that I could find. I only looked at BGG, but I know that the game is there, that the designer has put stuff up there. There were cases where, so like I'm looking at the reinforcement, there's no indication of where reinforcements enter. Now, there should be a rule in the rule book for this, because there's another thing where there's a few reinforcements that come in later in the game with no argument, with no statement of where they come in, and there's also if you're playing with one of the options, the historical options, which may make it less historical in some cases, you end up with replacement units coming on as reinforcements, and it doesn't tell you where reinforcements come on, how they come on. I could come up with a couple of different arguments that I would believe and accept, and I went with one that is, I think, the most common way to answer it, which is, well, they come from off map somewhere. Did I actually say that? No, something. Oh no, the line of supply. Yeah, the line of supply is defined. That's what I'm confusing it for. But I kind of basically said, okay, you can come in from anywhere where you could get, where you could trace the line of supply from. It's a reasonable answer, but for the Austrians, unfortunately, it puts their replacements way, way behind the line early on. Not necessarily if they do horribly. And it may not make sense with replacements, because replacements, you kind of feel like they would be reforming not that far behind the army, like to where they could actually retreat to, more or less. Of course, depending on how many turns the replacement role takes, that could be very different. Another possibility would be stacked with another unit of the same army. That would make sense. But anything other than off the map coming from off the map felt like such a dissonance with the sort of established rules, assumptions, that would almost always be clearly stated, but almost all games have the reinforcements come in from off map. So that felt more reasonable than like some kind of reforger type site a la NATO or something. Anyway. I didn't talk about the counters. So the counters are very, very thick. Laser cut, I believe, although they leave little side nibs on them, which I had to file. And again, this won't necessarily be the quality that's being printed anymore. And the printing quality on them is a little fuzzy. I mean, everything's readable, but if they were to put more numbers on the counter, I think it might become problematic. There were some nice factors to it, like the color coding for the different armies, which helps you distinguish them easily, but not really the rules to make that necessary. It's still a good thing, but yeah, there could have been more command and control type rules around that. The counter mix for this one is limited to the extent that rail cutting rules, which were standard, are standard in the East Prussia version, were made an optional rule here with you'll have to introduce your own counters for it. I want to touch into the rules a little bit because there's almost nothing here that's like, wow, that's interesting, that's new, that works. There's a little bit, there are little things that are kind of cool though, and so I want to take a few peeks at those. So one of them is that artillery just provides a modifier to the combat results die roll. If you have heavy artillery present, you get a bonus for it, which is a way of canceling out, say, terrain penalties and such not. And I think that seems to work fine. Stacking is 2 units. You've got, I can never remember the words for the different zones of control. What's fixed, what's fluid, what's this, what's locking. You got zones of control that when you move into them, you stop. You can leave them, but you can't go from one to the other. And they become kind of iffy because it's not clear whether hidden counters, again using an optional rule, have zones or not. Because there's dummies that don't represent real units? Do they project a zone? Stuff like that, that it's like, well, if they don't, what's the mechanism for exposing them? A bunch of stuff like that. Line of supply, strangely, is infinite across the board. Okay, this is not the strange part. That's pretty normal for this era. Well, not this era, but the type of game that this harkens back to. But you cannot trace supply through enemy-controlled hexes. Not controlled by a zone of control, but controlled by an enemy unit has moved through at last. Now, this is an awfully big map to keep track of all the hexes that units have moved through. And the front lines are not solid. At least when I was playing, it tended to be best practice to do the every other hex positioning that games like this tend to support best. Well, I already brought them upstairs, but it basically means you have to have some means of tracking all of the hexes that you've moved through, so that you can keep track of local control. It's possible. Unlike a game like Hitler's War or something, where, well, I've controlled all the hexes around these hexes. They can no longer trace, so they become mine. And that game gives you lots of counters to track this. In this one, no, you can only capture spaces by moving through them. And worse than that, one of the optionals makes cavalry unable to capture spaces at all. And given that some of the counters appear to be misprinted as cavalry or infantry, they have the wrong movement allowance for that. I'm not sure. I don't know the unit designations well enough and wasn't going to hunt them down. But they seem odd. That raises an issue there. Okay. Whenever units... so the game turn sequence of play is each player gets their own... It's pure I go, you go. Each player gets their own turn. There's no interactive aspects to it. But first player gets to move, and the movement allowances are tiny, but they get to move their full movement allowance. Then they get to fight. Any of the units that attacked, though, are flipped over and will not get to move or fight again. This allows you to make breakthroughs and whatnot if the defender is set up particularly badly or something. And then you get a second movement in a second combat phase, an exploitation movement in combat, as would be used in some other designs. Because of the low movement point allowance, because of the sort of solidity of the lines, it occasionally has an effect. We're not talking about something like the old Panzerkrieg here or something, where it really feels like it's breaking open big parts of the board. And that seems appropriate for World War I. Yeah, we're not in the trench warfare period, and it is the mobile era of the war, but it's not mobile the way World War II was. So it feels correct. It doesn't add a whole lot, but it's okay. Communication, the line of communication, supply, whatever, affects both your movement and combat ability. Your movement, it reduces your allowance by 1, which makes it less likely to convert spaces if you're out of supply already. And your combat capability is halved, which is pretty significant, and makes it very, very important to surround enemy units, because one of the things I didn't mention is the CRT here is very non-deadly and not particularly attacker friendly. Okay, so like 2-to-1 odds on a roll of 3 or higher, bad stuff happens to the attacker. That's a 2-to-1. There's a 1.5-to-1 and a 1-to-1. It's not a friendly chart compared to some of the earlier some of the games of the period that I feel like this harkens to. Overall, I think that's an okay thing. I think it works pretty well. Okay. You have rail movement, which is one of the places where there's a rules inconsistency. In the rule book, it says you can move infinitely by rail, essentially. You don't spend movement points, except in train and detrain. And on the map, on the terrain effects chart, it says it's 0.2 per hex once you're entrained. It's little stuff like that, you know, I don't know if it's going to cause anybody to really feel one way or another about the game, but there's a fair amount of it built up throughout the rules, and I just remembered that one. Aha! Nope. I was playing it right. It is specific, and I apologize. Reinforcements enter the map in the first movement phase on the turn indicated on the counter, entering from the side's map edge. From its side's map edge. So, yeah, I think I did that perfectly fine, and had a gripe that I shouldn't have. And, you know, that happens. I'm not getting paid for this. Okay. Combat itself. So combat itself is not required, which is a little different from some of these games. But if you attack with a unit, you have to attack all adjacent units with something. And that's very, very similar to some of those other old school games. And again, for the most part, that's the feeling I get, is that it's one of these. It's trying to be one of the classic, 1976 games or whatever. And given that the topic's now very well covered, sure, there's not that many games on it. I guess there is room, and those that there are way out of print, probably, unless Decision put out a mangled version of something. I can imagine that. Most of the terrain effects, being surrounded, being flanked, supply condition, not supply condition, heavy artillery. These things are all represented as modifiers to the die roll. The main thing that's going to determine how good your attack is a combination of those modifiers, although plus, one in any direction isn't probably that big a deal. But trying to cross a river is a huge thing. It's a 3-point penalty on attack if all the units are going across there. But the main thing is going to be the odds ratio. Now, the basic game is played with all the counters face up, and you can calculate those odds ratios, and it's going to feel kind of like, Avalon Hill, Stalingrad. There's an option to play with hidden counters, though. Now, one of my gripes here is that the attacker gets a huge advantage, I think. Whoever's the phasing player gets a big advantage by being able to see all of his enemies' strength points. And the playing with this option or without it, I think is going to create very different results. I know that my Austrians got hosed because of a bunch of crappy attacks I made early on. I think it would have been very, very hard to guess right and make the right attacks. With all the counters face down, with no memory of what they might have been, because the enemy has just set up, and all I know is what his counter mix is. That makes it very likely then that the initial Austrian offensive will not go as far as it did historically. If you have everything face up, at least this is my position on it, because I fucked up terribly. If you have everything face up and you're used to the combat results table and how ineffective it is to attack, you can probably target 1 or 2 hexes and maybe do something somewhat effective. This is interesting because in most games that I'm used to, targeting a couple of hexes isn't that big a deal. But somehow in this one, getting a couple of kills, because the counter mix is fairly low, for the size of the map, is enough to start the snowball going. To make it so that on your next turn, you can make further attacks around the edges and keep nibbling away. And maybe on the same turn on the next movement combat phase. Designer makes a big deal about advance after combat. He lets the defender advance. This is usually not a big deal, but it can be an important factor. And it can cut off an attacker's supply and make them either call off an attack that they wanted to do, or force them to make a bad attack, or a few other things. There are a few cases where it's really important, especially in the first round of movement combat for the phasing player, because it's got that multi-round dynamic going to it. There's some scenario-specific rules. One of the big ones is victory points are generated, and this is one of the gray areas where it's ambiguous in the rules. There are certain set of cities in the game that are worth twice as many victory points to the Austrians if they reach there by turn 12. It's not really clear if they're still worth the same amount at any other time. Like, are they actually worth 3 times as much? Twice as much, twice the value if Conrad reaches his objectives, plus the same value at the base value at the end of the game. That's how I played it, and that's what I think was intended. But again, it's left kind of fuzzy. This is an important role. This is what motivates the Austrians to attack. Both sides would sit back and probably do very, very little and nibble at the edges until somebody gets really, really lucky. But this is in particular a reason why the Austrians want to maybe throw their weight a little heavier than they should. Well, I threw my weight a little heavier than I should, and despite the designer saying in the designer's notes that you may find that the Austrians do much better than they did historically. No, they did much, much, much worse. It's a combination of not being that familiar with the combat results table for this game. It's different from many. And Conrad's offensive role, obviously, that motivates me to make more attacks. But also the nature of defense in this game, where it's hard to get a grip on units. It's hard. It's not like I don't know. There's just enough room on the front that you can pretty much you have a hard time getting a grip on the enemy surface and trying to peel away a piece or something. And then the hidden units, which make it so that my odds calculations don't exist. I'm making best guesstimates as to what kind of odds I have. The base victory conditions, yeah. So, the base victory conditions, each city or town on the map has a value. And this is the value that you get a double value of for Conrad's offensive gambit. Apparently, whoever owns the city gets that value. Okay? You also get points for every enemy strength point you destroy. I don't know whether or not heavy artillery count. It's not specified that I recall. And if you have 2 or 3 times what the enemy has in total victory points, you win the game. Otherwise, it's considered a draw. It's probably not that easy to get 2 to 3 times unless somebody fucks up the way I did. But I was well over the 3 times. And there was no way for Austria to turn it around. The 2 times, well, if Austria is going for Conrad's victory and does well on it, they're going to kick some ass. If instead they do kind of like I did, only maybe not quite as bad, they're going to get pushed back, and it's probably going to end up kind of a draw because Conrad got the initial glory off of some of the hexes he took and lost some victory points due to lost terrain. I forgot something about Conrad's victory points, though. And this is one of my real bugaboos, which is that every Russian setup hex, and there are a lot of them, counts as 1 victory point by turn 12. So, let me show you. So here's one army's setup hexes, okay? Every single one of these that the Austrians occupy is worth a victory point. Some of them are closer to the front and are more likely to be captured. So now I have to keep track of every hex that I occupy and every hex, not just these 6 cities or whatever, that I've occupied since the beginning of the game up until turn 12. That's a lot of record keeping to use. My assumption, I basically fudged it instead of doing it. Obviously, you probably wouldn't want to do that in a competitive game. The alternatives are to use 2 different sets of markers, one for the victory point hexes and one set for what do you control, if you want to keep track of that. And it does become important in many cases. And you will not get it right if you're fudging it. You will not get it right by the rules. I just decided, screw it, I can't cope with this. If I'm going to play the game at all, I've got to stop doing that. Another option would be to write down hex numbers of places that you've captured. That wouldn't be too bad. You only have to write each one down once. But there are a lot of them, so it would be a fairly large list. That solution works just fine for this, or counters for that are fine, or whatever. What doesn't work well is the victory point hexes being marked and all the control of hexes for line of communications. So the optional rules, hidden movement, I've already told you. I think that causes a lot of problems with the game. I think it causes the phasing player to have a basic weakness. They don't know what they're facing. You know, they know all their own units and their strengths, but they don't know how to get the right level of odds against the CRT. This is supposedly, along with all the other optional rules, more historical. Playing with this, I think, was the major factor to me getting a completely ahistorical result. They have further restrictions on cavalry to make them less capable of fighting, less capable of controlling hexes, but they give them an additional bonus of being able to withdraw before combat. Notably, you can do this in an attack, and it can cause the entire attack to be called off. This is huge. They can qualify. And you know what I didn't do with them? I realized. So the attack's not so bad because you've got these powerful cavalry. You can use your cavalry to attack a unit, retreat before combat, and then use units that were adjacent to that other unit to attack. And I just kind of, I misunderstood how that was supposed to happen. The way it's worded, I took it differently. But now looking at the wording again, I realize you can basically neutralize a defending hex by declaring an attack with cavalry and then not making it. Sort of screening or something. I did not use that at all. I don't think I would have been capable of using it right away at the beginning of the game. But it the cav retreat before combat may be, in conjunction with that and with some other factors, may be enough to make up for the hidden movement advantage for the defender, because you can knock things out. I had been arguing to myself it wasn't enough because of how I was playing, but I think I was getting the implication of that rule wrong. Some forced march options where basically as long as you don't go next to an enemy, you end up getting an extra movement point. Forgot about refugee congestion. Replacements is another one. Every time a unit gets eliminated, even if surrounded or whatever, you roll a die, which is pretty much the only way you eliminate things, so don't worry about that too much. You roll a die and it'll come back as a reinforcement that many turns later. Now, you could think, well, that prevents you from getting as decisive a victory. And yeah, I'm sure it does. I mean, the game that I saw, if the Austrians had been wiped out and not come back, it would have been more severe. They would have lost their whole country. I actually think that it says recommended, and I think it's kind of necessary. What's a little weird about it is this randomized coming back X number of turns. You get a 1, and you lost a unit that's close to the edge of the map. It's coming back and right back where it's supposed to be real soon. You roll a 6, or you're way over across the map from it using rail movement even. It may be many, many turns before that unit is able to get its way back into play. But it's better to get it back than to not get it back at all, right? A couple of others that I skipped over. So, I really wish I had noticed that cav, using the cav to screen an enemy so that you could soak without taking damage. Because I am very, very hesitant to do soaking attacks. A soaking attack is one where you attack at poor odds and basically sacrifice some units in order to get a good odds attack on units that are more important to you to hit. And the units didn't have a lot of differentiation here, plus not seeing the strength points up front. It makes it difficult to make that kind of decision anyway. But emotionally, I have trouble with soak attacks anyway. But I would have no problem with, I'm going to tie you up with this cavalry, which is not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed. You have to roll a die if the enemy has cavalry. In order to prevent that unit from being able to reinforce or whatever, and then I hit the additional units near it with better odds than I would get otherwise. I wish I had played with that. I feel like that mechanism is one that I would have enjoyed exploring. Of course, if I had played the next 12 turns after I quit, I would have continued playing as I was without noticing something like that. It didn't sink into my head, I'm afraid. Given all that, this would not be a problem. This game would not be a bad game in any way if a couple of things. One, get rid of the stupid line of supply over controlled hexes only, and making control have to be tracked. That's just problematic. There's a reason games don't do that. There is a reason games don't do that. It is too much of a pain in the ass to track, and I gave up on that completely. The Conrad victory points for the setup hexes are almost as problematic, just on such a smaller scale that, yeah, you could do them, but they're obnoxious. What I'd rather see is sort of how far did you get, rather than how many units did you get that far. So maybe a portion of victory points would come the closer you were to a certain city, until you get the full victory points for getting to the city within the Conrad offensive. I think that could cause the same kind of drive forward, even if you can't get the city anymore, where you're continuing trying to push, but you wouldn't be trying to broaden the front, which maybe is not such a good thing. But I think there would be ways of expressing this that would work a lot better than you have to keep track of all these hexes for the first 12 turns of a 20-turn game, which is what effectively it requires. So, I gotta swap. The hidden movement with the cavalry probe. I really wish I'd played that out, because I think that's the one really kind of charming feature here, that in conjunction with the retreat combat and whatnot, that because combat is very indecisive unless you surround the enemy. Now, the realities of surrounding an enemy in World War I and destroying units were fairly low. So what I'd have to say is surrounding an enemy is probably more of an abstraction than anything else. And remember, the unit's destroyed, but it comes back if you're playing with the optional rolls. You know, it has just made combat ineffective for a while. Which would not happen if you completely surrounded the enemy and destroyed them that way. I don't mind it too much in this level of game. I have a lot more trouble in a more detailed game when you start making those kind of lies. But here the lie that I've got him surrounded, and especially since it doesn't have a very permanent effect, it doesn't bother me that much somehow. The biggest flaw that I think I see is really with the quality of nailing down the rules. I mean, there were things where I wasn't sure what the answer really was. And I brought a few of them up. One of them incorrectly, maybe more than one incorrectly. But I think the game needs more playtesting, more blind testing than it currently has. Luckily, it's a print-on-demand thing, so revisions could go into play, and it could get better. As a solo-played game, I found all the counter-flipping somewhat disturbing. It took up a lot of effort physically to flip all the counters over. And again, I don't see much value. Like, to me, the excitement in the game, the thing that is interesting in this game is that interplay of the hidden pieces and the cav probing. Even if I didn't use it a lot the way I understood it, the fact that you can, like, create better attacks than the defensive line actually looks like it would absorb is just very appealing to me. And I don't know. Maybe I'll get to the East. Maybe I'll get to the Tannenberg one and give the system another shot. Given how much I screwed up that part of it and didn't look at it carefully enough. But yeah, the places where there felt like there were rules inconsistencies or things that, some of it, like take the reinforcements thing. Reinforcements are explained. Somewhere there was a section that talks about reinforcements. I'll tell you where it's not. It's not in the rules that tell you when the reinforcements come. it's not in there. Okay. It's down here. I mean, it's not hidden or anything, but it's in the movement section. It's not a bad place for it. And it's not very big. And it would have been helpful. So there's not a lot of cross-referencing in this. And in general, that's not a big problem because the rules are short and they're not very verbose. It's easy to find what you're looking for. But when it spells out, units from the 8th and 9th armies are set up adjacent to their entry hexes on the map and enter the game on turn 2 as marked on their counters. All other units with reinforcement turns are placed on the turn track for their appropriate turn. A little C-roll 5.3 right at the end of that would have meant that I didn't lose it, and then likewise, when you hit the replacements roll, it also talks about place the units on the appropriate turn, indicating when it returns as a reinforcement. So I had looked in 2 places for the reinforcements, didn't remember seeing them, and didn't look through the whole rule book to keep looking to see if it's there. This is something that happens when you don't have cross-references. It's easy to forget stuff. But yeah, that was an example where that's definitely not, that's definitely my fault that I saw that. But I'm trying to remember another one that was not my fault. And now I'm feeling stupid and not able to think. Oh yeah, rail capacity. The way rail capacity is worded, that the edge of the map thing I think was the worst case, and now I see that I'm wrong about it. The rail capacity is an amount that allows a value that allows you to entrain units a specific number of times per turn. But it doesn't seem to have anything to do with units that are already on the map, which feels counterintuitive, but the rules are clear. I think there was another place where I felt the rules were clear, but I'm not sure I believed in them. Trying to remember what that was. But anyway, that's the impression I got from the rules, was that... And you saw, if you watched the playthrough, you saw me trying to hunt for certain rules and whatnot. That they were a little too shaky for the starting player. You would be better off picking up, one of the older SPI games. I'm not going to point you to Avalon Hill because Avalon Hill rules, at least in the post-Don Greenwood era, well, once Don Greenwood took over, are just hideous. I mean, nobody should have to have learned from them. The SPI rules are pretty solid for most of the games of this type. Even when there's horror stories, you can usually figure it out pretty easily. And then, for the older player who's looking for this kind of more nostalgic game, this does look like it provides a twist. It does look like it provides a little bit of a twist with the hidden movement and the way the cav works in it, that makes it not completely a pointless thing to play. And again, if you're willing to do a little bit of work, tweak a little bit around the edges, you might have a pretty good game. At that same level without having to go out and try to find, the War in the East quad. Now, I'm trying, and plus, they link together, supposedly, eventually. There was something else I wanted to hit on, but don't remember what it was. I really don't remember what it was. Oh well. I guess this one goes up. And I don't feel like playing Leipzig.